This is St Andrews, South Brisbane. Last week, Vicky told me why she likes my sermons. She said, because they're personal and because you inject humour into them. I'm not too sure what she meant by personal. Does she mean personal application, or that I use personal illustrations, or perhaps a bit of both? But yes, I do tend to say things tongue-in-cheek, although I know that British irony can sometimes be lost on people. Sometimes the Old Testament is referred to as the Jewish Scriptures, although I would say that the New Testament has a decidedly Jewish slant as well, all of its writers being Jewish, apart from Luke. A lot of the Bible is imbued with Jewish idiom, and I fear a lot of it passes us by, particularly if we take it too seriously. What I mean by that last comment is that it contains a lot of Jewish humour. I don't want to go too far into the area of stereotypes, although it has to be admitted that stereotypes are usually grounded in at least an element of truth. There is such a thing as Jewish humour. Wikipedia tells me so. The Canadian-American writer Saul Bellow said, "Oppressed people tend to be witty, and there can be an element of gallows humour." Margaret, my rector's warden in Vancouver, was critical of our bishop there after the bishop had been part of a religious panel discussing Easter on the CBC. In telling me about this, Margaret told me what the other panellists, Roman Catholic, Jewish and Muslim, had said. Actually, I can't recall what she told me about any of the participants, apart from the rabbi, who, Margaret told me, said something about family, which is what you'd expect a rabbi to say. So there you have it. Two stereotypes to do with being Jewish: humour and family. And I think you find generous helpings of both in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. And if you link family with the personal and interpersonal relationships, it ties in with Vicky's comment about my sermons. So they're biblical right from the get-go. This sermon is part of a series on the Old Testament patriarch Jacob, and he's meant to be the hero of the story. At least he's the one chosen by God to do great things. But you may have been struggling to warm to him, given what he's been up to. If that's the case, you may appreciate Genesis chapter 29, where Jacob receives his comeuppance, ladled with a heavy serve of irony. Please turn to page 29 in the church Bibles. Jacob has been forced to flee. He's offended his brother Esau to such an extent, by trickery, that he's in fear of his life. Unfortunately for Jacob, he falls into the hands of his uncle Laban. And Laban, as we shall see, shares some family characteristics. In short, when Jacob enters Laban's household, he meets his match in more ways than one. Jacob arrives, and things appear to be going swimmingly. How deceptive first appearances can be. I'm reminded of that TV interview Prince Andrew did. Have you seen the dramatisation? Scoop. Apparently, Andrew thought the interview had gone well, but then was hit with a reality check. Well, it's a bit like that for Jacob. There's the dialogue between Jacob and the shepherds. I know what that can be like. The city boy, a little bit posh, meets the country folk, eager to take him down a peg or two. The responses Jacob elicits may be described as staccato. We're from Haran. Yes, we know him. Yes, he is. The cocky new arrival, Jacob, proffers the old hands the benefit of his advice. Or is it a command? Look, he says, the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture. Then Jacob has an opportunity to flex his muscles. He's been working out, and show off some more. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Jacob is reduced to tears of joy. There's kisses, first with the lovely Rachel, then with her dad, Jacob's uncle Laban. It's hugs all round, and Jacob has an opportunity to be impressive all over again by telling Unc what he's been up to which Laban rounds things off nicely with the words, "You are my own flesh and blood." Jacob had had to flee because he's deceived not only his brother Esau but also his father Isaac, and as a result, family relations back home had been tense, to say the least. Jacob arrives with nothing, no possessions, no family to protect him, no home to go back to. All of that was a situation of Jacob's own making. And that's the way God leaves it. He allows Jacob to stew in his own juice. Jacob may think he's fallen on his feet, meeting the lovely Rachel and her apparently benevolent father Laban. Perhaps Laban represented in Jacob's mind the father he never had. Remember, his father, Isaac, had favoured Jacob's brother, Esau. I think we're meant to compare and contrast Jacob's meeting Rachel with how Jacob's father, Isaac, had met Jacob's mother, Rebekah, back in chapter 24. In both cases, there's a well and herds of camels or flocks of sheep, and a beautiful woman. What's the big difference? Chapter 24 is soaked in prayer, lots of it, whereas in chapter 29, prayer is notably absent. Jacob, resting on his own ability and perception, is oh so vulnerable in so many ways. He's off guard, thinking all is sweetness and light, and he falls into Laban's none too benevolent power. Verse 15, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Things seem to be getting even better for Jacob, but in fact, the seeds for the con are being sown. Verses 16 and 17. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, we're told, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Jacob was well and truly in the people category. Leah may well have had a nice personality, but Rachel had a lovely figure. Charlie Screen, our speaker tomorrow night, has suggested that Leah had weak eyes could be translated as she made people's eyes hurt. Jacob makes Laban a proposition in verse 18 that cunning Laban gives the appearance of agreeing to without actually doing so. Verse 19, Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." We move on 7 years, just a twinkle of an eye to love-struck Jacob. And ever-benevolent Laban appears to come to the party again, this time literally. Verse 22, so Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. We need to understand what's meant by feast. First, a wedding feast was usually 7 days long. And second, the Hebrew word is connected with the word for drinking. My Polish relatives say that the Polish reputation for drinking is exaggerated. Maybe, but what happens next suggests that Laban was liberal in letting the wine flow. In the Church of England, you can only get married between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., a rule designed to avoid "it was dark and I married the wrong person." Certainly there was no electric light in Jacob's day. It was after 6 o'clock, and he appears to have been well oiled. Oh, and for good measure, Laban makes sure his servant Zilpah is on hand as a witness. Then comes those words in verse 25, and however tragic for Jacob, I can't help thinking the writer, Moses, intends them to be read with a wry smile. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." Can you see the irony in this turn of events? Can Jacob hear the anguished cries of his brother and father echoed as he says, "What is this you have done to me?" The arch deceiver, Jacob, has had the tables turned on him. Leah was the one with supposedly weak eyes, but it's Jacob who was the one who couldn't see what was going on. And back in chapter 27, it was Jacob who'd switched himself, the younger, for the firstborn Esau, when deceiving his father Isaac, whose eyes were so weak that he could no longer see. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt blindsided by unexpected circumstances, much like Jacob when he discovered Leah instead of Rachel? How did you navigate through that moment of disillusionment and uncertainty? Just as Jacob's relationship with Laban and his daughters are shaped by familial ties, how have your own family relationships influenced your understanding of God's love and grace? Maybe you've grappled with feelings of betrayal and deceit, similar to what Jacob went through. I invite you to consider how God is at work in the intricate tapestry of your family relationships. In the men's Bible study on Tuesdays, we've discussed the place of discipline, for example, in bringing up children. In Hebrews 12:10 we read, "God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness." Take a moment to consider how Jacob's story may mirror aspects of your own life and the ways in which God's discipline can serve as a guiding force in our journey of faith. I think what happens to Jacob is meant by God to be a wake-up call for him, akin to the one Nathan gives King David regarding his sin toward Uriah and Bathsheba. You can read about it in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. Yes, God may have chosen Jacob, but he still wants him to change, and the same applies to us. Have you ever experienced a wake-up call from God, a moment of profound revelation or correction that redirected your path and deepened your faith? How did you respond to God's discipline, and what lessons did you learn along the way? May I encourage you to reflect on the ways in which God's love and discipline intersect in your life, and how you can lean into his transformative grace in every situation. Just as Jacob faced moments of deception, vulnerability, and divine discipline, so too do we encounter trials and tribulations in our own lives. Yet, in the midst of our struggles, we find reassurance in the unchanging character of God, who remains faithful and merciful even when we fall short. Jacob's journey reminds us of the transformative power of God's grace. Despite Jacob's flaws and mistakes, God remains steadfast in his love for him, ultimately leading him to redemption and reconciliation. Similarly, through Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, we are offered forgiveness, restoration, and the promise of new life. May we, like Jacob, learn to navigate through the complexities of our relationships with humility and trust in God's guidance. Let us lean into the transformative grace of Jesus, allowing his love to shape our hearts and actions. May our lives testify to the faithfulness of our God, who works all things together for the good of those who love him. Amen.